We are joined today by Greta, Aurora, and Adi Agam to discuss alternative common sense viewpoints on womanism, the alphabet community, and men's rights. Recently, Hungary's stance on certain woke ideologies have been a talking point on both sides of the political spectrum, with the crazy lefties being outraged as usual because someone opposed their fragile perspective and the right wing nuts thinking it is the land of milk and honey. Um, First question to you, Greta. Welcome. Good to have you on. You are originally from Hungary. What's your thoughts on the Hungarian viewpoint on womanism?
When I was growing up, it was never really a matter of discussion. So I've been living in London for 10 years now. And obviously, I follow the situation back home and I visit as often as I can. But I'm pretty confident. I haven't seen any recent polls, but I'm pretty confident the majority of people wouldn't identify as feminist. I'm not sure about the proportion of people that would be actively against feminism, but most of my female friends, pretty much all of my female Hungarian friends, would say that they feel perfectly equal to men, and men would probably say that if feminism was ever needed, it's definitely not needed anymore. I would say that's the general stance for like mainstream position. Obviously, you see more and more you see the Western woke ideology kind of filter into certain discussions in the public life. So because the media is so, well, I don't want to say the media is dominated by the left, because anyone who knows Hungarian media would disagree with that. But most public figures, celebrities, tend to lean left. I think that's kind of true all over the world. So and those are the kind of celebrities and public figures who pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the West, and they often TV shows try to kind of mirror or mimic Western shows and things like that. So you see a bit of influence there, but generally I would say the relationship between the sexes is much healthier than it is in Western countries.
Okay. And Adi, good to have you on also. And have you got anything to add to Aurora's point?
Yeah, firstly, hello to Greta. Good to make your acquaintance, and thanks to RPR for having me on. Yeah, interesting points that Greta made. I read in a leftist media article that the Hungarian family minister, who is a female, Catalin or Caitlin Novak, encourages women to be more feminine, to not compete with men, to accept lesser pay as a sacrifice to raise a family, not in a discriminatory way, but in a more wholesome way. I think that's a refreshing stance from what you get in the West, because the West is quite how do you say, they're very combative. So the feminist journalist was quite outraged, but translated it as, from Hungary's viewpoint, they were encouraging traditional heterosexual families to thrive, which never happens in the West. And they were aiming to make the men and women be a unit rather than be at odds. And I like that. I wanted to ask Greta if she knows whether or not the Me Too culture and false accusations are a big thing in Hungary, or as they are in the West, or are they not? I imagine they're not, but I would like a confirmation from her.
So the Me Too hysteria wave kind of swept through Hungary briefly at the peak of Me Too, I guess about 2 years ago. There were some scandals. There was a handful of, again, public figures who were accused of various things they'd done in the past. And I think there was a theater director who I think lost his job, and there was like a talk show host who also was fired from his job. But those were people who were kind of controversial to begin with. So I think there were kind of political motivations too in the background to get rid of those people. And that's very similar to the current allegations against Andrew Cuomo. So it's that sort of vibe. People who are not liked by a lot of people, and they just use this as an excuse, as the last straw to kind of get rid of them. But it wasn't generally a big thing. It really was just kind of concentrated around a few months, I would say a couple of months, and only a handful of really high profile cases. So nothing like what we have here and in the US. And also, sexual assault laws in Hungary are a bit different. So obviously, harassment at the workplace is illegal, and I think it's regulated quite well. But you can't say you were raped unless there was some violence or force, physical aggression used. So I guess rape is just defined differently. In the UK, my understanding is that it's basically lack of consent, and it is the accused who has to prove that he had consent. So in Hungary, it's the accuser who has to, well, often obviously it's difficult to prove, but the accuser at least has to argue that there was physical force of some kind, or that alternatively that she or he was in a state of mind where she would have been unable to agree to the act. But I think it's a more common sense approach anyway.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but it's crazy how that the Me Too stuff has actually spilled over to a nation like Hungary. But what is comforting is that they have common sense laws. Like in the way you just detailed there, you detailed how the UK is different, where it's on the accuser to prove. In Hungary, it's on the accuser to prove that the crime actually happened, and in the UK, it's more about the accused proving it. So at least they have that. But yeah, that's quite eye-opening. I never thought that Hungary would have came under that umbrella of Me Too allegations, but it just goes to show that it infiltrates every nation.
Yeah, it's like a trend. It's kind of like a fashion trend. It always takes a year or two to catch up, but these things do sweep through the entire globe usually. It's just that some cultures are more susceptible to it, I guess. And then having a certain legal system, obviously the way laws are defined, the way crimes are defined, really determines how these cultural hysteria are perceived.
And just Greta, this is another question for yourself. I read in regards to the alphabet community that becoming transgender is considered illegal in Hungary, which is recent law, I believe, and that gay couples are not allowed to adopt children. Could you expand a bit more on that, and how do you feel about that yourself?
So when this government came into power, this wasn't Orban's first time as prime minister. I assume most listeners will know at least who the prime minister of Hungary is, which, just as a side note, it always surprises me how many people know who the prime minister of the tiny, irrelevant country is. So that says something about his leadership. Even his enemies will concede that he's a very talented politician. And I'm not a fan of his, but he definitely has a natural talent for what he does. So basically, when this government came into power for the second time, over 10 years ago now, they rewrote the constitution fairly early on. And one of the first things they did is redefine marriage, or define marriage to be between a man and a woman. I'm not sure what it was exactly, whether I don't even think it was defined that precisely in the constitution before that, but this was obviously a very profound, very significant change, because this means that it's basically impossible. We can't even entertain the idea that same-sex couples could get married, because it is in the very foundational text of the state. It basically says that it would be unlawful and impossible. And it's more recent. That the transgender thing is a bit more recent. It was, I think, less than 2 years ago, maybe just over a year ago, that they very clearly defined the meaning of biological sex. And it's an interesting one because in Hungarian, we don't have two separate words for sex and gender. So we just have one word, which means both things. So the very first time I heard someone explain to me what gender means, it took me, I kind of get it, I think. I kind of get where they're coming from. But it took me a while to really digest that idea, because in Hungarian, we don't differentiate. So basically, what they've done now is they're saying that the word for sex and gender, which is nem in Hungarian, it basically means biological sex, which is determined at birth. And that's the sex that goes in your identification documents, your passport. And this law says that you can't change that. So my understanding is that you can get sex reassignment surgery. So in that sense, it's not illegal to pursue the desire to change gender, but you cannot legally alter your sex, which is, I'm not 100% sure how I feel about that. I know I can tell you how I feel about the marriage thing in the Constitution. I don't agree with it personally, but I understand where they're coming from. I understand this government's intention at, as you pointed out, encouraging men and women to work together, to be a team, to be a unit. It is a beautiful idea, I guess. It is at the end of the day at the root of a healthy culture, having strong relationships between men and women. It's very important. What I don't like, though, is when it becomes exclusionary. And I really don't like the words exclusion and inclusion when used in the woke, as part of the woke vocabulary, but
Yes.
there is something to be said for being tolerant, like tolerant in the classical liberal sense, and just allowing people to express their nature, to embrace who they are. So I just feel like Hungary is probably not the best place to be if you are gay, or definitely if you're transgender.
Ali, what's your thoughts on the alphabet laws in Hungary?
Well, like Greta, I don't really care what people do behind closed doors. I don't hate anyone for their preferences. The alphabet community, as you call it, has been around since biblical times, and it is what it is. But I do think it is over the top when people make their orientation their identity. I know people that have that type of preference, but it's not their identity, and I see them as people before I see their orientation. Some people might call it the trans stuff mental illness. Others might call the LGBT people a mafia. Again, I couldn't care less what people do. I can be cool with anyone as long as they don't mistreat me and are respectful and aren't crazy. However, other nations should be free to exercise their religious beliefs and cultures. So I know the alphabet community is banned in like 70 countries, and Hungary is free to do what they want. It's up to them. It's their culture, and I think they should have the freedom of that choice. I do agree with kids being in traditional male-female parental homes. I just feel that that's better for their development, and I don't think kids should transition or be encouraged to do so. Kids should be kids and decide what they want to do when they are adults. I think people who push for that are disgusting, and have ulterior motives. I also feel that people should have the choice to undertake conversion therapy. I know that's a little bit controversial and off topic, but if they want to do that, they should be able to do that to become heterosexual in the West, not in Hungary. Some people may have made the choice to be an alphabet, as you call it again, because of popular societal influences misguiding them, and they just want to fit in. But I think that people should have that option. It shouldn't be cut off. And if Hungary has the viewpoint that they want to curb that the development of the alphabet community in their country, I think it's fine. I think that they're an independent country and they have a culture and they have a religion. Maybe it's religious, maybe it's just cultural, but they should have that choice. What do you think about that, Greta? Do you think that every country should have their own viewpoint?
Well, I also wanted to respond to your comment about kids being adopted by same-sex couples. But first, well, I don't think any country is a monolithic community. I don't think there's such a thing that a country wants this or that. I know what you're saying. I don't want to. I'm not disagreeing with you on a fundamental level. But one issue I have with the current Hungarian government is that it's becoming more and more authoritarian. And everyday people have less and less of a say in what actually happens. And that's an issue. So we don't really know what the people want, because once a government has 2/3 of the seats in the Hungarian government, they can do whatever they want. They no longer need to try to debate with the opposition, to try to convince any other party. So that's what has been happening. That's the way this government has been governing for over a decade now. It is becoming, I mean, they were elected and they were re-elected and they will likely be re-elected again next year. So you could argue that that's the say of the people. But that's just my thoughts on that. And when it comes to kids being adopted by same-sex couples, I think it should be allowed simply because I think it's better for a child to have two parents than none. It's even better to have two parents than one. And my stepsister is a social worker, and she works with orphans. There are so many kids who are taken away from their parents because the parents are alcoholics, so they're just too poor to look after the children. And those children are brought up in these institutions with they don't receive any love growing up whatsoever. It is really, really tragic. So I would say if there's a loving same-sex couple that would provide good conditions to bring up that child and would give them love, I think that's any day that's much better than being stuck in one of those institutions until you're 16 or 18.
Mm-hmm.
Greta, when you sorry to come in there, David. All I'm saying is that Greta, when you put it like that, that is a good point. It's better to have one set of parents that are loving than zero parents or one set of parents that are abusive. So when you put it like that, yeah, I can see your point.
Greta, just to ask you, in terms of Hungary's current laws on abortion, it seems to coincide with the West, but I saw that they are trying to change that. Is that because Hungary encourages religious values? If so, why are they so lenient with the abortion laws?
So I'm not aware of any planned changes. I think the abortion laws have been working pretty well. I don't think they've been changed for several decades. In Poland, they were obviously changed recently. And so I actually think that what we have in Hungary is the ideal way to legislate abortion. So it's up to 12 weeks, and the woman has to have 2 meetings with a midwife or with a therapist to make sure that's really what she wants. And I think that's pretty reasonable. It's always going to be an arbitrary limit, and 12 weeks is very arbitrary, but I think it is very reasonable because within 3 months, most women will know if they're pregnant or not. And in certain cases, when there's a medical reason, it can be extended. But in the UK, when I first heard that in the UK it's legal up to 6 months, I mean, I actually know someone who was born at 6 months. That is just, I just can't get my head around that. I mean, that's like a fully formed baby. That's crazy. But
wow.
Sorry. Right, just another question for yourself. Seeing as you're Hungarian, you'll have insights into the leader Orban that us non-nationals won't have. And can you elaborate on things you feel may be wrong with his leadership?
So corruption is a huge issue, and I believe there is corruption in pretty much every country, apart from Singapore maybe, and then you get killed. In Singapore, you get killed for money laundering for like the smallest crime. But I think in most liberal democracies, or in most democracies, you have some level of corruption. I think the issue is when the government doesn't even try to hide it anymore. And that's kind of what's happening in Hungary. And that's what I find really disturbing. So the wealthiest person in Hungary is a guy who he grew up, he's from the same town as Orban. They went to the same school. It's like it might be a village actually, not even a town. So they've known each other all their lives. And this guy ended up becoming the mayor of the village. And he doesn't even have an education. He's like an electrician or a gas man. And gradually, over the last decade or so, his wealth has been accumulating to the point, like really, really mysteriously. It is one of the great mysteries of the world, actually, how that guy managed to accumulate the equivalent of over $1 billion. It's like almost 2 billion now. So what's being done is that the government is encouraging an oligarchy system, kind of similar to what they have in Russia. And a lot of people might think, who don't know much about Hungarian history and culture, they might not see it as such a big deal, but it didn't used to be this way. So corruption didn't used to extend to these levels. I mean, what we have now basically is that we have a handful of major companies in construction, manufacturing, transportation, all that. And those few companies have very much monopolies, and they just end up getting all the big government commissions. And that's one of the ways this guy I mentioned has become the wealthiest person, that he just bought more and more of these companies, merged them, and created these massive monopolies. And he was once asked in an interview a few years ago that there was 1 year when his wealth grew by a bigger percentage than Mark Zuckerberg's wealth in that particular year. And a journalist asked him, like how come your wealth has grown so much more than Zuckerberg? And his response was, well, maybe I'm smarter than Zuckerberg. So there's this sort of thing that's what I mean, that they're not even trying to hide it anymore, and they're laughing about it. And that's what's really obnoxious. And at the same time, this wouldn't even be a problem if people were living well. You know, most people wouldn't care. As long as you have everything, you have your daily needs met, you don't necessarily care that someone else has it better than you. But there is real poverty. There are parts of the country that I've never even been to that are really far from the part where I'm from. But like the eastern part of the country, close to the Ukrainian-Romanian border, there is real poverty there. I mean, there are villages. And then there's the issue, there's a bit of a race issue, which I don't know how much you know about the Romani gypsies, which is a really significant percentage of the Hungarian population now. And in those really poor parts of the country, it's mostly those people living. There are huge regions with small villages where it's almost like 100% Roma gypsy population. And it feels a bit like the state has given up on those people. And they've tried. One could argue that they genuinely did try to help them with various programs, but it never worked. So when you see that kind of poverty and children, you know, like not being able to eat properly or have proper clothes, it is really, really enraging that the government is just handing out money like that to their friends. So that's my biggest issue with the government. On an ideological level, I agree with a lot of what Orban says. I probably agree with him more often than I disagree. But I try to be as objective as possible. I try to look at everything from as many different angles as possible. So I'm trying to give you a fair assessment.
And Adi, what are your thoughts?
I think what Greta said was fascinating, because when you hear, like at the start, when you've done the introduction, you hear the left people being very outraged about issues that are non-issues, and then you hear the right people talking about how Hungary is like the mecca of conservative values. But what she just said was insight from a person that knows the country, and it was very objective. It was very fair. I'll start with regarding abortion. I'm easy on that. I mean, it's a massive grey area. If a female has been a victim of the word that rhymes with grape, then she should have the right to have an abortion. Or if a guy has been a victim of the word that rhymes with grape, he should be able to have the right to say he wants that to happen. Or if a guy's been a victim of paternity fraud, there's just some examples, but there's many more grey areas. In regards to corruption, like Greta said, everywhere has it. I feel like in the West it's just very blatant, but it's quite sinister. They hide it. It's blatant, but it's sinister. In other nations like Hungary, it's quite open. You can see it from what Greta was saying. But Western nations pretend like it doesn't exist and brainwash people into following their regime. They make people believe it's for their own good. But yeah, it was nice to hear that there is faults in Hungary also. It's just realistic the way that Greta was talking. I wanted to ask Greta how going on a tangent, I wanted to ask her how the divorce courts treat men in Hungary and what the parental rights men have over their kids if there is a split in their relationship.
So it is still, I guess, the tender years doctrine is still standard practice, I think, in most European countries too. What might be a bit different, again, I'm not 100% sure how it works in the UK, for example, but my understanding is that even if there are no children, if a couple divorces, the woman can claim some form of support. I think that's how it works in the UK and probably in the US. So we don't have that in Hungary. It all depends. So the courts are supposed to be looking at the interests of the child. And I personally know of examples where the man was given custody. And when that happens, that's usually because the woman is, for some reason, not capable of looking after the child. And in this instance, she was an alcoholic and she was like quite aggressive too. I'm not sure if she had to pay anything. She probably wouldn't have been able to anyway. And the man had a good job. He was looking after the children. But that's still unusual. So generally, I would say probably over 99% of the time, the woman gets custody. But again, the man only has to pay support if there are children, which I think makes it fairer. And
yeah, it sounds fairer. It actually sounds fairer because in the UK, it's similar to the US. It is more centered towards the female rather than the child. And just you saying that in Hungary, that it is more centered towards the child, that is fairer, even if it means that 99% of the time that the female gets the custody, as long as they consider the male and they think that what is best for the child, that is the prerogative. That's the best thing. It should always be about the child. It should never just be about female rights. I think that's where the UK and the US and Australia, etc., most of the Western nations, Western Europe, go wrong. They always think about the female before they do the child. And just the fact that they think about the the child first before female or male or mother or father. That's a good thing. They do that in other nations, like in more Islamic nations, where they actually think about fathers' rights and the child's benefit first. But again, that's again a tangent. But I like that. I like that about Hungary. It's more common sense point of view.
Greta, how do you feel about how do you feel Hungarian culture compares to Western nations, and what are your feelings on the hypocrisy of culture?
The hypocrisy of what?
Uh,
Sorry, what was?
so I'm just going to repeat the question again. How do you feel Hungarian culture compares to Western nations, and what are your feelings on the hypocrisy of Western culture?
You know, I've also spent a lot of time in the US, and I often get asked to compare Hungary to the UK and to the US. But there really aren't that many differences. One thing, the first thing that usually comes to my mind is that I think that it has been shown in various surveys that Hungarians and Americans are the biggest tippers. We tip the most when we go to a restaurant or, you know, with a taxi driver or whatever. But like when it comes to cultural differences, I can think of things like family values, which kind of ties in with what we've been talking about. So I guess divorce rates are catching up with the West in Hungary, but they are still lower. I think it's less than 50%. It's still less than 50% of marriages that end in divorce, I think, last time I checked, which obviously is not great, but I'd like to think that maybe in Hungary people are more inclined to make things work rather than throw them away without much thought. But like when it comes to fundamental ways of thinking, obviously I would say British people might be more open-minded in a very general sense. Although, again, it depends. Like Budapest, the Hungarian capital, is probably the average person living there is probably more open-minded or more tolerant of like same-sex couples walking down the street holding hands than someone living on a farm in Tennessee. Like I you know, that's a massive generalization, but
Yep.
yeah.
Adi, same question to yourself. What is your own opinion, or what do you think?
I mean, I think Hungary's immigration policy is quite strict. However, again, like I said before, it is their country and they are free to do what they want. If someone doesn't like it, leave or don't go. I've been to many woke places, quote unquote, Belgium, Holland, Spain, France, Germany, etc. And I think Hungary seems better. Nowhere's perfect. Nowhere is going to be that land of milk and honey, like you said in the intro. Poland sounds good. Ukraine is good. Sounds good. Even places like Russia and Bulgaria and Croatia seem better on a traditional level. I like common sense outlooks and I like traditional culture. And every nation has their issues, but the West, in my opinion, is just nuts. Western nations are so arrogant. Like Greta said, they have an open mind, which is a positive, but they think that they know better than every other culture, every generation, every religion, every tradition in the world, and try to impose that ignorance on everyone. And that I feel is true discrimination. That is something that they need to curb. Around 60 years ago, it used to be that somewhat open sexism towards women was okay. Examples of open racism towards people of colour or coloured people, I don't know the terminology, was okay. And being straight was celebrated, which I think is fine. Now it's blatant sexism towards men, which isn't cool. Racism towards white people, which isn't cool. And being alphabet, as you said before, is promoted. And I feel like there's no significant change. It's it's as if the West has solved nothing via Marxism. It's just kept all its prejudice and just swung the pendulum the other way. We need a middle ground, and I just don't like the ideals because the motive is just, in my opinion, is just to keep people as consumers and at each other's throats. I don't know if the same type of cultures exists in Hungary. What is your opinion on that, Greta? Do you think that that is a thing that they do in Hungary?
Actually, yeah, that is something I wanted to comment on with regards to immigration and wanting to preserve the traditional culture. So I guess one hypocrisy of Western Europe and specifically the leadership of the European Union would be that they've been trying to force these migrant quotas on all member states. Now, luckily, this is not something the UK has to worry about now, but Hungary and Poland, Czech Republic, few of these countries were fighting back against that. And Orban gave a very good speech that I have to give him credit for, which Douglas Murray actually quotes in his book, Madness of Crowds, where Orban talks about how it is fine for Germany and France and other countries, but mostly Germany, to want to pay for the sins they committed in the past. I guess for Germany, it's the Holocaust. For France, it's the colonies. So these countries, if the leadership feels like they really have to suffer for crimes committed by previous generations, which no one alive today has had any role in it. But if that's how the country feels as a whole, that's fine. Let them do it. But it's just not fair for them to force other countries, Central and Eastern European countries, that not only had Hungary never had a colony, but we were colony. We really were colonies. And one could argue that we might still be, in a different way, the colony of Germany. I guess one could make that case. But to put us in the same bracket with nations that, and I'm sorry, I'm talking to British people here, but I just don't see it as fair that just because we share the same skin color, we don't have the same history. So one thing that a lot of people forget, and that's why Black Lives Matter movement also is quite hypocritical, is because not all white people have the same history. I mean, you look at Hungarian history, it is going from being subjugated by one culture to the next. The Turkish, the Soviets, the Germans, the Tatars killed lots of men or sold them into slavery, sold the women into sex slavery. I mean, there were some very, very terrible things being done to people from that part of Europe. So the thought that the idea that we should share in the sense of collective guilt is absolutely ridiculous. And I obviously don't think British people, French or German people alive today should feel that they need to suffer now.
Yep.
They have to flagellate themselves for the sins committed before them. I don't agree with that whatsoever. But Orban was just making the point that if the leadership of these countries wishes to look at their own history through that lens, that's fine. But let's not force other countries that had nothing to do with that whatsoever to do the same thing, to take in migrants just to make up for past sins. I think in Germany this is very, very evident. I don't know what author said, it was a journalist who wrote this article. It was at the height of the migrant crisis 4 or 5 years ago, where he said that he was looking at the young people in Germany who were welcoming these refugees, giving them flowers and hugging them and all that. And what this journalist was saying is that the feeling he got is that these people were happy that for once people are fleeing in, not fleeing out of the country. And on a deep psychological level, I think this is something that's very significant. But again, we don't all have the same history.
That's a very good point. Greta, just one last question. What are your thoughts on the sensitivity of certain people who practice Islam outrage, and also what the Hungarian stance is on Muslim culture?
So there is a lot of anti-Muslim propaganda, which is way over the top. So I have been to several Muslim countries, and I love them, and I have friends who are Muslims. So in Hungary, again, it just shows what a talented politician Orbán is, that he just recognized this potential threat, and he recognized the potential in using it, in using the movement of refugees to kind of build up passion and to create this false narrative that we can somehow unite against something, and that just, I guess, uniting against something creates this false sense that we are somehow all fighting for the same thing, we all want the same thing. And this kind of makes sense, I guess psychologically it makes perfect sense. But what this means is that if you go to a little village in the middle of nowhere in Hungary and talk to a 90-year-old person who has lived their entire life in that little village and never left once, if you ask that person about Muslim culture, like what they know about Muslim culture, they're going to tell you that they are terrorists and they are all terrible people and they want to invade us and they want to run Hungary over, when the truth is that no one really wants to. None of these migrants really wanted to live in Hungary. They wanted to migrate further west. But anyway, the government has done their best in the last decade to turn the population against Islam as an ideology. And that is, I don't know if that's the price to pay for preserving what they believe is Hungarian culture. I guess one could argue in defense of that. I still don't think it's a great way of approaching the problem. There were a lot of flies. They just did a lot of classic propaganda, putting up these massive signs and spending lots of money on TV ads to do a lot of fear mongering, basically, and to show people, especially people who can't even afford to have TV subscription beyond the state-owned channels. So there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who only really watch the few channels that are owned by the government, and it's nothing but government propaganda. And yeah, I'm not, obviously, I don't believe lies and fear-mongering is ever the solution. It's also kind of infantilizing your own population, almost like underestimating the intellect of your population by trying to appeal to their feelings, like show, which might be true, by the way. Like Ayaan Hirsi Ali's new book is all about the surge in sex crimes in Sweden, especially Sweden, I guess maybe Germany. And she talks about migrants who came from Syria, Iraq, who committed these sex crimes and how there's been this surge. But then these are all obviously tragedies, or at least something that's very serious and countries have to cope with. But then to use that, for the Hungarian government to use that to emotionally blackmail and manipulate their people into opposing an entire religion or like several cultures that are not even homogeneous. I mean, obviously we know that not all Muslim countries are the same. Obviously not you don't have two Muslims who are the same as each other. So I'm just not a fan of generalizations in general. But if what the people really want, if democratically you can show that the majority of the Hungarian population really does not want to take in any immigrants, then that's fine. People should be allowed to make an informed decision on that. The question is whether you can make an informed decision when you're being bombarded with this government propaganda. So that's the main dilemma, I guess.
And Adi, you know that background well. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a traditional Muslim background, and I love how objective Greta is about the situation. I like how she said that just because the Hungarians or the Eastern Europeans share a skin colour with the UK, that doesn't mean that they share the same experience. When I went to Eastern Europe, my experience was I seen white people in a totally different way. I didn't see them as separate. I seen them as the same. And when I'm in Britain, I see the woke stuff as making me feel apart from, and it makes me feel different. And I feel different from white people. But when I went to Eastern Europe, I just seen them as people because they were very upfront and they were just about day to day stuff, and I liked that. That was my personal experience. When I think about Islam, I feel like this whole leftist stuff when they try to champion Islam, it contradicts the values because people that really practice Islam, they don't like feminist values, they don't like LGBT values. So when these actual groups try to champion that, it seems silly, it seems contradictory. And then also when you hear about Muslims that voted for Joe Biden, that seems stupid as well because Joe Biden recently bombed Syria. He's with Obama, who invaded many Muslim countries. Trump didn't invade any Muslim countries. He did have maybe a few issues with Iran, but he didn't invade countries and didn't bomb children. So that's what I feel like. The people that are outraged are silly, and I think the people that get outraged over cartoons of a prophet, they're not real Muslims. I know real Muslims, and they don't give an F about cartoons or whatever else. They want to practice their religion, and they want to just live day to day. The guys that get outraged, they're tied in with these leftist people, these woke people, and the cartoon should. I mean, if you're going to do a cartoon, you're doing a cartoon in order to get a reaction. And if you're giving a reaction, you're an idiot that's giving a reaction because you feel like this is a gang, this is an issue. There are people who are Muslim that do have viewpoints that are prejudicial. There are people that are Muslim and Jewish and Christian that are bad people. And there are people that are Muslim, that are Jewish and Christian, that are good people. And that is just the reality of life. If you really look at it on a political level, I know I mentioned Obama, but Kamala Harris, right? She's not Muslim, whatever, but she's incarcerated many black people and brown people. It's not about color or religion. It's about money for these people. Saudi Arabia and Israel and the UK and the USA are all in business. That Saudi is Muslim, Israel is Jewish, and the UK and the USA are traditionally supposed to be Christian countries. Saudi killed a journalist. Recently, it's swept under the rug. The Hajj festival is a tourist attraction. Israel has done atrocities towards Palestinians. The UK and the USA are corrupt, as we spoke about. It's just it's as if it's just about money and power. There's no such thing as white privilege. It's more so, in my opinion, Western privilege. If Greta was to go to Hungary with a British passport, she would have privilege over the other Hungarians. If I was to go to a nation, a Muslim nation, with people with the same skin colour as me with a British passport, I would have privilege over them. So it's Western privilege rather than white privilege. It's not about colour. And these titles like BAME and people of colour or coloured people or whatever the hell it is, they're created by the West. They're created by leftists. I think that's more separatist than anything else. Going back to how I was treated and how I had an experience with people in Eastern Europe, it was fine. It was very upfront, and I liked the way things were. I liked the way it was upfront. If I was a white man, I would go and live in a place like Hungary or Poland or Russia because it would be advantageous to me. As a brown man, I would maybe go to a nation like maybe Morocco or somewhere in an Arabic nation. Maybe they don't have the same freedom as you would have dating wise in Eastern Europe. But yeah, that would be an option for me. So yeah, again, it's very objective. I don't think we should demonize the average Muslim on the street, but I do feel like we should have a discourse where we can talk about the faults in Islam and the faults in Judaism, just like we talk about the faults in Christianity, without being called Islamophobic and without being called anti-Semitic, because that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to come to a common sense solution towards our very underdeveloped human problems that we have in this day and age. Lastly, I would just like to ask Greta if she adheres to any religious philosophies, or if she's more of a middle of the road type of person.
I used to be a militant atheist. Like I was a huge Richard Dawkins fan, and I met him several times and was so happy to have him sign those books. I used to be a huge fan of Christopher Hitchens too, and Sam Harris, but not anymore. My thinking has become a bit more nuanced. I now recognize the good in all religions, and also the psychological significance of believing in something, in some sort of higher power. And what that means, I guess, for the individual and for a culture is that you have a sense of objectivity. So what we see in the West with the decline of Christianity is that there's this natural progression, I guess, towards a mentality where everything goes. And individualism is a great thing. I believe people should be treated as individuals. But what that means, ultimately, unfortunately, is that you lose this sense of shared values. And what the purpose religions have served, I guess, historically, is to give cultures a basic foundation on which to agree and which to defend and fight for. And a culture that's overwhelmingly made of atheists just doesn't have it is very difficult to have any uniting values whatsoever, or to agree why those values are good. Because if you're religious, it doesn't matter which God you believe in, but you can just say that it is wrong to kill, or any crime you want to think about, it is wrong because God says so. And that's powerful. I don't believe in God, so that statement doesn't hold any special significance for me, but I see how it would for someone who's religious. And if you don't believe in anything, not only does it have a negative psychological impact, I believe, like I think personally I would be much happier if I could believe in something. But also, it just leads to these constant arguments and debates. And debates can be good. But if you reach a point where you can just no longer agree about anything, like you have no common ground as a people whatsoever, I think that's tragic. And that's the end of that civilization. So that is the reason the Hungarian government is really pushing for Christianity. One thing I forgot to mention is that when they rewrote the constitution about 10 years ago, they did include, one of the first statements in the constitution is that Hungary is a Christian country. And the majority of people don't go to church. I guess the average person might be slightly more religious than they are in Britain, but we don't have like overwhelmingly religious people. But what the government is trying to do is symbolic. And again, I understand where they're coming from. They're trying desperately to go against this transformation of Europe and to kind of preserve what used to be the uniting force. I guess religion is kind of like the connective tissue of a culture. And this government, a conservative government, they're trying desperately to preserve it as much as possible. And I think that's an honorable intention. I have no problem with that, but yeah, I personally don't. I'm more of a pagan in heart. I'm fascinated. I'm obsessed with ancient mythology, especially Greek mythology. I think I have trouble with believing in just one god. I like the idea of there being several gods and goddesses, and then that's kind of what I like.
Greta and Adi, thank you both for your stimulating opinions and conversations. People, check out the links in the description below to follow Greta's channel and to contribute to our website. Thank you guys both for this great um, communication. I'm just going to end the podcast and I bid you guys a good day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to you, RPR, and thank you to Greta. Great points made and a stimulating conversation. Cheers.
Thank you.